One of the things I know when working with a live session like this versus like a actual record is that capturing and providing the energy of the band is really the most important thing. Like getting the energy to come across is what will kind of make a live mix versus making it super clean.
You turn another page, you tangle all loose ends tonight. Where you gonna run? Where you gonna hide? The boys are back in the Bronx tonight. It's you in the left, connect to in the right. The boys are back in the Bronx tonight. I'm swinging for the fence, the baffles in her eyes. The boys are back in the Bronx tonight.
When we recorded it, we had the drums isolated in a booth, so they're a little bit on the drier side. We had the vocals isolated in a booth. Obviously, you know, the lead vocals rather isolated. And then we had the 5 other musicians all together, and they were all facing each other. And I mic'd them to minimize the amount of bleed from the other instruments, you know, using different polar patterns and positioning and everything. So I actually ended up with a fairly clean recording. Everything had a really great separation, but we also had to kind of, that meant that when I was mixing, I had to inject some more kind of vibe. So I mixed everything clean. That was kind of the first goal, get everything sounding really, really nice. So I did what I always do. I start with the drums. I pulled the drums up and I kind of went through every single source and made them sound really nice. So let's just kind of play the drums soloed. You can kind of hear what they're doing. The drums that we used sounded really, really good. The kick, you know, I did kind of my normal thing. I have an Ssl style compressor, or channel strip rather, on more or less everything. One of the things I really wanted to do was bring out the like the smack of the kick drum, because for this song it's very, very driving. It really needed to have like a forward kick sound. So. Let's see, this is the kick-in microphone. So we got a few things going on. We got the channel strip. I'm doing a little bit of EQ here. I got a little bit of the top end brought up. The mid-range, just a little bit in the mid-range at like 1K. So we got a little bit of diff here, a little bit of compression. Not a whole lot, you know, we're not rewriting mixing in this here. An additional EQ to kind of carve out a little bit of some problem frequencies, and then we kind of get into compression territory. So I've got kind of wanting to make sure that all the transients are accounted for. The kick, the snare, eventually the toms, all the transients are kicking through in a not like necessarily aggressive way, but like a very pleasing way. After the Novatron, I have what would be like a harmonic distortion kind of thing, the Omega Transformer series from Kush Audio. This is an API style transformer op amp. I think it's probably a little bit more of their op amp sound. Just a little bit, not too much, because I don't want it to be too hairy, just a tiny, tiny bit. And then another compressor. I actually added this one later in the mix. These first 4 was what I started with, but as I started mixing, I realized that the kick drum really needed a bit more aggression in the compression aggression. So I threw on this Compex plugin from Boz. So this is a really amazing compressor. You can see here, hitting around -4, not too hard, a little bit of EQ, nothing too much, just a tiny, tiny little bit to bring a little bit more presence out. And then I brought in another EQ at the very end, shelve out a little 130, knock off a little bit of that 3K that was probably really after the compression, probably brought it up a little bit too much. And then using this is the Fab Filter Pro Q3, which has a dynamic EQ function. And I'm using that on around 1400 with a fairly broad Q to push up a little bit of that smack without making it too pingy. So that's the kick in. The kick out, which is gonna give you a lot more of the low end, a bit more simple. Similar plugins, I wanted to use the same plugins to kind of make sure that the delay compensation was fairly similar. The sonic characteristics were kind of similar to the kick in. Shelving off a lot of the top end, a little bit of the subs, under 30 hertz, no one needs that. Cutting out some of the low mids, upper mid, low end. Little bit of compression, -3 dB here. Nothing, yeah, just a little bit. But together, you can hear, makes a pretty nice sounding kick drum. So let me just bypass all that. You can see how it's bypassed, even with the slight volume drop. And I actually did a little bit of level matching here, so it's not that much of a volume drop. The energy really drops. Becomes a little bit flabbier, a little bit less controlled. You can hear once with everything on, you get a lot more presence, a lot more attack. And that goes throughout the rest of the drum set too. I mean, the drum set is the core of almost every song, right? That's one of the reasons that you start with it. It's gonna provide you the energy, it's gonna provide the momentum forward a lot of the times, especially in this song. And a lot of the other elements, the acoustic guitar, even the fiddle and the accordion, are playing as a percussive role to the drums. So they're all complementary. So you really wanna make sure that those drums are providing the energy that you need. So the snare drum, the drummer brought his own snare. It sounded really, really nice. I felt that it was just missing a little bit of the crack and a little bit of the lower harmonic body of the snare drum, what I like in a snare drum, me personally. So I added a sample onto it, which isn't replacing the snare sound, it's helping to augment it. So all the snare sound is still in there. This is just adding a little bit more sonic depth to the sound, a little bit more complexity. So the snare drum by itself, without the sample, this is what it sounds like. I mean, that's a pretty good sounding snare. In the context of the song, I just felt like it could have a little bit more extension. So I added this sample. This is what the sample sounds like by itself. So you can hear it has a lot, to me it has a lot of the elements that the other snare is missing. A little bit more sizzle, a little bit more crack around in the 1500 range, and a little bit more body around 100 hertz. So together, when you add those three together, without the sample, with the sample, adds a little bit more attack to the whole thing. I've also added a sample in there that has a bit of a room sound, that makes it a little bit wider sounding, which, since this was in an ISO booth, it was very, very dry sounding, I felt helped add a little bit of ambience to the drum set in general. So let's listen to the whole drum set together, and I'll take out and put back in the snare trigger. So that's without it. That's with it. Now let's hear it in context with the song. So I'll start with it in, I'll take it out, I'll put it back in. So for me, it just really helped the snare to cut through. on top of everything, since there's so much happening. That snare really needs to punch through the mix. So that was a big thing for me. The rest of the stuff, you got the toms, you know, the overheads, the rooms, you know, that all kind of adds to dressing. The tom, the floor tom actually plays a pretty big role in the. So much like the snare drum, I wanted to make sure that it cut through, but it sounded really good to me. I didn't feel like I had to add any samples or anything, so.
Mills down the river, couldn't hold spirits at bay.
Once I kind of had the drums going, I started bringing the other instruments. So the bass, the guitar, everything. And I should mention that I'm not listening to these in a vacuum. When I started, I listened to, before I even added a single plugin, I listened to everything by itself. And I made a bit of a rough balance just to kind of get a feel, figure out where things were going to go, you know, just get a sense for the mix. Even though I'd recorded, I kind of already knew, but it was a good refresher, you know, a couple weeks after having recorded to kind of see what was going on and what each instrument was doing. All right, so moving on to the bass. So for the bass, we just took a DI. We didn't have the space or the isolation to do an amp at the time. So we took a DI. This is what the DI sounded like by itself. So the bass player was using I think he was using a Mustang as a short scale bass. It was actually really nice sounding for a short scale. Oftentimes short scales don't have as much extension. This might not have as much extension as like a P bass or a jazz bass, but it's still pretty well balanced. But you know, we still need a lot more balance, a lot more low end. So the first thing I did was I ended up reamping it through the Universal Audio Ampeg SVT model. I mean, we all know Universal Audio, they make amazing stuff, and their bass amps are particularly incredible. So the SVT and the flip top, the B15, are two go-tos for me for bass amp sounds. So I stuck with the SVT. I just felt that it'd be the right kind of vibe for this stuff. Let me just bypass all the other stuff I have going on. So this is, I'll play the DI sound without the bass amp, and then I'll put the bass amp in. So this is just the DI. That's with the bass amp. So, you know, you get a little bit less of a mid-rangey sound, a little bit more extension on the top end, a little bit more low end. And then really everything else after that, you know, I have a little bit of compression going on with the SSL channel strip, a bunch of EQ happening on the Pro Q3. Another Cush Audio plugin, the AR1, is really, really amazing. I can't recommend it enough. It sounds like you're mixing through an authentic piece of tube gear. It's really great. So I've got that on. That's really hitting pretty hard. Minus, probably, what is it, 8? Minus 8. Again, I don't really pay attention too much to the numbers. I just kind of crank the settings until I get to the sound I'm looking for. I felt it was a little bit toppy sounding after I added all this stuff. I didn't want to keep EQing, so I used the Omega Transformer Model N, which is a Neve style, you know, Carnhill or St. Ives style transformer from Cush Audio. Big fan of Cush Audio. They make really, really great vibey pieces. But the thing that this does, it's a little heavy-handed, but it really does a great job of rolling off the top end. So let me just play this without it, and I'll put it in. So that's without it. That's with it. So it's subtle in the fact that it's not jumping the volume, but you can really hear the way it affects the sonics of the sound. It rolls off the top end a little bit, pushes up the mid-range, the lower mids a tiny, tiny bit, makes it a little bit gooier sounding. So that with the DI sound, which I, again, just have some EQ, a little bit of compression, tiny bit of overdrive. You start to get like something that kind of like really is just a punch through. Just sits really, really nice with the drums. And again, this is a situation where I'm not getting those sounds by themselves. I'm mixing it in the context of everything else. So making sure that it sits well with the drums, then bring the guitar in and the fiddle and the accordion and the vocals, and making sure that everything is working together. After I've gotten the basic sounds for that, moved on to the guitar. So the electric guitar was recorded at the studio through a Fender Deluxe. I think like a late 60s Deluxe. It's a great sounding amp. But when I went to go mix it, we didn't really have the time or the flexibility to really hone in on the guitar sound. I threw a mic on it. We did our best to kind of get the sound right at the time, and then just went for it because that's what we had to do. But I took a DI early on, and I ended up coming back to my studio and reamping it. I have I think it's a 73 twin reverb. So I ended up reamping his sound through my twin reverb, and getting just a little bit more control over how it would sound in the mix. And honestly, doing that after the fact is really nice because you already have the whole picture. You know how everything sits together. And you can say like, man, that guitar maybe just has a little bit too much top end. I wish I had a little bit more low end, low mids. I wish I could fix that. And when you can reamp it, you can just get that to fit right in the picture of the mix. As far as what I'm doing mix-wise, after I reamped it, I use this 4000 series channel strip on almost everything. The only thing it doesn't go on is vocals. And the reason I use it, this is from Brainworks through Plugin Alliance. One of the things that I love about this particular channel strip versus the one from UAD or Waves is they modeled 72 channels of a 4000, every single one individually. The tolerances, the differences. So when you put it on every single channel, you have the option to hit this all button and it randomizes which channel each thing is on. And you actually do end up with a more depth in your mix than you would from just, having a single same model on every single channel. So I find that very valuable. I mix mostly in the box. I'm always looking for things that will give me more vibe, more character, more unpredictability. Because that's what we love about analog gear, and that's what we're trying to recreate in the box, or at least I'm trying to recreate in the box. Vibe, distortion, essentially. So I've got this on here. I'm just adding a little bit of mid-range, low mid, around what is this, 1K, so a little bit mid-range, dipping a little bit of the low mids at 225. Nothing super crazy, a little bit of high pass filtering, a little bit of compression. The channel strip stuff is, as you'll see as we go along, very, very minimal. Again, with the EQ3, a little bit more EQ, just a little bit more surgical, thought out EQ. Again, with the Omega Model N, adding that low mid transformer saturation, and then a compressor to even it all out. The one thing I do have here is a delay. This is on bypass. I have it automated on bypass. It comes in just during the guitar solo. Because when we were recording, the guitar player had a delay pedal that he would kick in on the solo, add a little bit of ambience. And I didn't want to lose that vibe. I really, really liked that. So this is just me recreating what he did with the Valhalla delay. So this is a tape style delay, a little bit on the clear, like a more modern tape. And an eighth note, so we can lock it. I tapped out the tempo. We were able to lock it to the grid. Once you kind of add all these things in, I just have to do a little bit of correction, bring down a little bit of the low mids, bring up a little bit of the top end, bring back a little bit more clarity without getting it spitty. So why don't we listen to the guitar soloed without any of the plugins, and then we'll listen to it with everything on. So you can see that me adding the plugins in adds a lot more, presence to the guitar. Kind of makes it cut through a little bit more. So if I were to mute everything except for the drums and the bass. If I mute the plugins, what I've done in the mixing, the guitar gets a little bit muddy, a little bit further in the background. Even when I turned it up, it didn't sound as present as it does with everything on, turned down. It's just helping to get it to kind of sit on top of the drums and the bass a bit. There was only one electric guitar player. So one of the things I did do was I doubled it to the right channel just a little bit, just to add a little bit of width. And I did that later in the mix. I did a couple versions without it like that, and it just felt that there was so much energy in the electric guitar that just wasn't being matched. So I've got the electric guitar on the left-hand side, wasn't being matched on the right side, that I needed to kind of bring that energy in a little bit. So the doubled guitar kind of does that a little bit. Then we get to the acoustic guitar, which really, in the context of this song, you know, he's playing the chords, but for the most part, kind of functions more as a percussive element with the drums, almost like what a shaker would do with against the drum groove. So he's using a guitar that has a lot of string noise. It's an acoustic that had a lot, like, it wasn't super deep sounding, which I think in the context of this whole band is absolutely for the best, because it occupies its own space. It's not eating up space from the guitar, the bass, the drums, or the accordion. It kind of sits a little bit forward. So I had that in the middle, and I really wanted it to sit with the drums. That was the goal, kind of help to reinforce that groove. He's doing a lot of, you know, flourishes and with his picking. So if we listen to it without whatever changes I've added. We've got good separation, but there's not a lot of transient information going on. It's there, but it's a little bit masked, a little bit lower. So for me, it was all about bringing out that transient information. So again, I actually don't even think I'd use the channel strip on this. It's just there, adding a little bit of the character. We did a little, I bumped up the mid-range, you know, whatever this is, about 500 through 3K, just pumped that up a little bit. A little bit of the top end. Again, here using the multiband or the dynamic compression of the EQ at 5K, almost 6K actually. Kind of this cut here, the high pass filter, knocking out a little bit of the boxiness of the acoustic and bringing out more of the picking. And then after that, it's just compression. Again, using the attack and the release to really strategically focus the transient information. So making sure that the picking, the attack of the pick is kicking through, and that any of the other kind of unwanted resonance is pushing down a little bit. And then after that, it was all harmonic adjustments, so kind of making it more interesting sounding. I had this other Omega plugin, this 458A, which I think is maybe an Ampex or something. Essentially just adding a little bit of tube saturation and transformer saturation to that. And then the decapitator, everyone loves the decapitator. And that's just squashing it a little bit. The decapitator I added later on the mix because I just felt the acoustic, when brought in with everything, even with those adjustments I made, just felt a little anemic. It felt a little bit like everything was sitting here, but the acoustic was kind of sitting like up and small in the background. So I wanted to kind of get it to bloom a little bit and steady. So the decapitator is almost acting as a compressor in that regard, but also really, really kind of obviously distorting, folding itself, smushing a bit in the context of everything. So, just kind of adds this rhythmic element that's helping to move the mix in the song forward with the drums. And then we kind of start to get to some more of the melodic instruments. So we have the accordion, the fiddle, and then the rest of the vocals. The accordion is for the most part playing pads, but then sometimes playing melodies with the fiddle. The fiddle is often playing a melody on top of the vocals. So there's a lot to kind of reconcile here as to how it sits in the mix. Since the fiddle was an electric fiddle, it kind of poses, in some ways, its own challenges. On one hand, it's nice because it's totally isolated from the other instruments. So when we were recording in the room together, I didn't have to really worry too much about bleed. But also, it doesn't have necessarily the presence and the resonance that a normal violin would have. So, you have to think to yourself, like, well, how am I going to treat this? I did put a mic on it, and the mic, its only function was to capture the bow on string noise. So let me just play that. By itself, it almost sounds completely useless, which I definitely thought to myself many times while working on this mix. But in the context of the DI for the fiddle, it actually adds a lot of character. So the fiddle by itself, a fiddle like this is using a type of pickup called a piezo, and they have a very, very distinct sound. And they don't have a whole lot of attack. They're very, very kind of like round sounding pickups. And they don't capture a ton of body, just inherently by the design. But when you add in the string noise, it actually starts to sound like a violin. Like that's like a pretty convincing violin sound. Because of how high energy the song was, the DI fiddle by itself won't cut through. It has to almost function like a guitar, where it's a little distorted, it's a little bit more present. So what I did was I ran it through a classic SansAmp. Everyone loves. SansAmps have been around for such a long time. They're really great pieces. So I've got a SansAmp on it, which I actually ended up using while tracking, just to kind of get the vibe, and liked it so much that I kept it while mixing. And then, a bunch of EQ to kind of tame it. So if we kind of cut out the EQ, this is what it sounds like with just the SansAmp, just the violin's DI sound, no bow sound. Again, using a dynamic EQ here, very, very powerful option, and then bringing up a little bit of the top end, around 5K on and up with a high shelf. Cutting out a little bit more of the offensive frequencies, around 2.5K. And once I found that I had that under control, I kind of started adding, again, some more distortion, a little bit of compression. One of the challenges that I faced while mixing this was, since everything was so well isolated, the drums, the vocals, the miking, the close miking on all the individual instruments, they weren't sharing the same space. When I mixed it that way, it felt like everything was in a different location. Everything was in a different space. Sometimes that can work on a mix, but in the context of these guys, that wasn't the case. I wanted to know I wanted to convey, what would it be like if I walked into a bar while these guys were playing? What would I hear? How would it sound? How would the energy feel? What would be coming across from a live context? So I added a little bit of reverb. And then I doubled the DI sound And I used, this is a great plugin from UA, the Ocean Way Studios. It's a reverb plugin, but it's a room model plugin. So it's not just a reverb. You can also get direct sounds off of it from the close miking. So I have it set on the string setting in their A room. Again, that's the DI by itself. That's what the Ocean Way string modeling room sound. And that, to me, sounds like a very convincing violin sound. So now when I add those three sounds together, like you almost start to get the sense of a full violin playing in a space, you know, really in a high energy situation. So I bussed those all together to an aux, did a tiny bit of more, you know, EQ. This EQ here, it may seem really drastic, but these are all very fine, for the most part, fine cuts. I'm just knocking out frequencies that are offensive, things that are really kind of kicking through on their own. And as you can see, I'm using it as a dynamic EQ for the most part. So they're not even being employed all the time. It's just at specific spots when maybe one note kicks up 2K, gets a little bit peaky sounding, it just knocks it down. And then I added a delay. And I did this to kind of mirror the vibe of the guitar, add a little bit of a slap. So this is a 16th note slap. Almost adding less of a delay and more like a short room. So in the context of everything, let's hear that without the final few things. So, you know, in general, that's feeling pretty well balanced to me. It sounds like the violin is playing off the guitar, the acoustic is playing off of the drums, everything is kind of pushing and pulling in the way that I would hope a mix in this context would. So now we get to the accordion. So it's really adding kind of a bed, like a harmonic bed to the mix. So, you know, I did a little bit of, I did some compression, some EQ just to get it to fit with everything else. A little bit more compression with a Fairchild to get it nice and smooth. The one thing I did do was, after I got the vocals in, the accordion and the vocals were occupying a very similar space. And instead of sitting there and automating the accordion off of the vocals, I added a compressor that's keyed to the vocal. So every time the vocal comes in, this compressor on the accordion squeezes a little bit and pushes the accordion down. You can hear the accordion ducking down a little bit with each word. And that just helps the vocals to kind of sit better in the mix. It helps the accordion not to sit on top of everything too much. It just pushes it back a tiny, tiny bit. A little bit of EQ after that just to clean up around 700 hertz. And then about halfway through the mix, I just felt that the accordion could occupy more width. Originally it was in the middle. It just never felt like it was sitting anywhere to me. It just felt like no matter how much I turned it up, it was never really there. So I threw a little bit of a chorus on it to kind of push it out a little bit wider, since there's not too much happening on the sides other than the violin and the electric guitar. So in between the violin and the electric guitar, those are hard panned, you know, pretty much. That's like the next widest thing to the drums. So it doesn't sound like it's very super wide. It just sounds like it's pushed a little bit. It's leaving more space in the middle. Again, leaving room for the vocals. Then I move on to vocals. And depending on the mix, I don't always do vocals last. Sometimes I do the drums, bass, and then vocals, and then add everything else around it. But since there's so much energy happening with this song, the vocals I thought could be mixed last, only because they really do occupy their own space in this mix. So, you know, we used a really super nice mic on his vocals, an M49 classic Neumann tube microphone. So it already sounded really, really great. For me, it was always about injecting more character. The control was already there. He's got a great voice. Just making sure it was steady in the mix and that it kind of matched the energy. So if you listen to the vocals without anything on them.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets. You wanna bury the old hatchet while you're sharpening your teeth.
So you can kind of hear he's got that aggressive sound to his voice, but it's not a screaming or shouting aggressive, just natural raspiness. Probably the biggest challenge, almost with any vocal, but in particular with this one, was taming the sibilances. Part of it's just the microphone that we used, but also the way he's singing. So I have my first EQ, doing a little bit of low pass, a little bit of mid-range ducking, bring up a little bit of the top end presence, 13K, and up. Then I'm compressing. I have a 1176 Blue Stripe hardware compressor, so I'm using that as my first compressor. Then a second compressor, another fab filter, the Pro C2. And this is a pretty standard chain for vocals for me. On the vocal setting, and just hitting it so that it's around -6.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets.
So let's listen to it without that compressor in.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets.
So the 1176 is a pretty fast release, slow attack, really kind of getting those consonants to kick through. And the C2 helps level it out.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets. You wanna bury the old hatchet while you're sharpening your teeth.
And that sounded pretty good to me. And then after that, it's really a lot. The next two things I do is all about sibilance control. So it's a de-esser from Fab Filter.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets.
So I've got a side chain on here, so it's picking up between 5 and 14K. And then I use a multi-band compressor. And this thing I use partially as a de-esser and partially as a frequency kind of control on the mid-range and low end. So you can see here on the top end, the upper mid-range 2K to 10K to top end, and then the air frequencies 10K up. I've got a very fast attack, very fast release, a super hard knee, but I'm just tapping it. It's just gonna help to kind of control some of those frequencies. So let's take it off.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets.
You can really hear on those S's how much sibilance there is. So let's put in the Pro multiband.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets.
You can even see on the graphic how it's really only triggering on those specific frequencies. The reason I do this is because you really need good sibilance control, de-essing. But if you try to just use a de-esser heavily or a couple de-essers heavily, you're gonna end up making them sound like they're lisping. So using a multi-band compressor where I can kind of tailor the two different bands to attack differently and at different degrees helps to really make sure that you're not gonna get that lisping sound. It's, those harsh S's and T's get controlled, but they're still present. And then after that, again, it's some more compression and harmonic adjustments. So I added the black box on as a distortion box. Sometimes I use this very subtly on vocals just to add a little bit of depth and dimension. In this case, I wanted to distort the vocals. So if we take a listen to it without it.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets.
Now, if we put it back in.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets. You
can really hear how it's adding this depth to the vocal. It almost makes the vocal sound like it's right in front of you. Then after that one, I add another AR1. This is another compressor just to kind of bring a little bit more life back to the vocals.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets.
And then I always follow up with an EQ after the compressing for the most part, just to help round out the sound. Again, doing a little bit more de-essing at 9K with a dynamic EQ, and a little bit of dip at 3.5. This may seem drastic, 252 hertz high pass filter, but it's an extremely gentle slope, 12 dBs per octave. So it's doing a lot, but it's not as noticeable as you think it would be.
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets. You wanna bury the old.
So it's a very natural sounding high pass filter. So if I put that into the mix,
The miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets. You wanna bury the old hatchet while you're sharpening your teeth. And all the chain mills down the river couldn't hold spirits at bay. They haunt you every night, much like the tremors the next day. It's on the radio.
so you can really hear how the vocals kind of just sit on top of everything, but without sounding too disconnected from the rest of the music. So I follow that same kind of principle. The background vocals, are there as support. They have a couple lead moments, but for the most part, they're intended to be kind of a support to the main vocal. So if I just solo these and play them,
Tremors the next day. Whoa!
so I wanted to treat the vocalists, the background vocals, they're singing pretty aggressively. I really wanted to exploit that. So I used a lot of the same plugins I used on the lead vocals, tailored to the individual vocalist, but then hit the black box a lot harder. I really kind of hit it a bit harder to really get a bit more of aggressive kind of sound. So when we listen to those guys together, I'll take it from the chorus.
Not much like the tremors the next day. Whoa, it's on the radio. Whoa, you dodge a bullet there. Whoa, you turn another page, you tangle all loose ends tonight. Where you gonna run? Where you gonna hide?
I wanted the background vocals to function like if you were at a show with these guys and you were shouting in the crowd. That was kind of what my intention was behind making them. So they're a little bit further in the background, but they're really, really aggressive. So while I was mixing this, I got everything really clean sounding, but one of the things that I struggled with, because everything was so well separated, was, like I said, making them sound like they were in the same place. So I did something that I normally don't do, but I thought was very appropriate for this mix, was I sent literally everything to a separate reverb. You can see here I have this aux, put it on everything in pre-fader, copied my fader settings to the preset, to the aux rather, and I used the Ocean Way room modeler. So the idea was to make it sound like they were all in the same room together. So if I solo this, and I added a little bit of EQ and a little bit of limiting with a double lock.
Not much like the tremors the next day. Whoa, it's on the radio. Whoa, you dodge a bullet there. Whoa, you turn another page, you tangle all loose ends tonight. Where you gonna run? Where you gonna hide?
It sounds like you're in a room, like you're like in the hallway leading to the room that the band's playing in. That's kind of like what it feels like to me. Like you're in a bar, you're at the bar ordering a drink, and they're playing in the bar, and that's what it sounds like. So what I wanted to do, I did a little bit of EQ just to kind of tame some of the top end, essentially make more room for the actual mix. And what I did was, since it was all pre-fader, I blended it in. So let's listen to it without that room sound in there.
Not much like the tremors the next day. Whoa, it's on the radio. Whoa,
And now this is with it.
not much like the tremors the next day. Whoa, it's on the radio. Whoa, you dodge a bullet there. Whoa, you turn another page, you tangle all loose ends tonight. Where you gonna run? Where you gonna hide?
I didn't want it to be super obvious. It's pretty subtle, but it's in there. It's adding a little bit of this smearing effect, a little bit of this depth of location. So it's almost, it adds a little bit of this, like room kind of sound that fools your brain into thinking like these guys are all in the same room playing together. With this context, I thought it would really kind of do something cool, especially if you're watching a video of them playing in the studio and you hear it and it's super, super clean. It can often feel like there's a disconnect between what you're watching and what you're hearing. If you make it sound too good, your brain's like, those are two separate things. But when you add a little bit of this smeary messiness, it kind of helps your mind to focus on the fact that they're all playing live. I've got all my individual tracks and all my reverbs and everything, and they're all being bussed to my master auxes. So this is kind of where some of the magic really happens. I don't necessarily balance through this with the exception of one exception, which I'll show you in a second. They're all just essentially going there, and then I use them as overall level control to my stereo bus compressors and stereo master bus processing, which is some EQ, a little bit of distortion, whatever. I'll show you in a second. So the drums get 3 parallel channels. So I have all the drums you can see here going to drums. And those go to 3 auxes. You can see the drums up here. And what they are is a clean track and then 2 parallel compression tracks. One is super hi-fi, punchy, lots of top and lots of low, and cut the mid-range, very compressed. And then the other one is distorted, thicker, gooier. And I blend those together to kind of get the sound that I want for the particular mix. So if I mute the other masters and we just play the drums, I'll kind of show you what each one is doing. So this is all 3 together. If I mute the parallel compression, this is just a clean track. Punchy, clean, and sometimes this is all a mix needs. I've got a double lock, but as you can see here, the mix is at like 0.5%. Very just kissing the double lock. The EQP1 Pultec. Classic on drums. A little bit low end, a little bit top end, nothing super crazy. But then let's solo the other stuff. So this is the, I call it my drum hype. Very compressed, lots of transient information. Jacking up the top end. Low end a little bit. Compress it, and then compress it again using the compacts, and you get this crazy drum sound. Totally unusable on its own, but when blended in, adds a little bit of presence, adds a little bit of punch. It's all about subtlety. It's just adding a little bit of vibe. Now the other one is doing the same thing, but in the opposite direction. Gooey, very, very vibey sounding. And now I'm getting that, so I've got EQ knocking off the top end, knocking off a little bit of low end, low mids. The Novotron, this is a great compressor. As you can see, heavily hit. Using their saturation aspect on there, attack and release, kind of tailored to what you need on the song. But again, if we put that in with the track, adds a little bit of this kind of like cool glue. It's one of those things where it just adds a little bit more depth and character to the drums than they have by themselves. So it's blended taste kind of situation. The rest of the instruments I'll just get a stereo master where I do maybe a little bit of processing, a little bit of EQing, some more harmonic stuff, just to kind of add a little bit of vibe. This guy, I'm using this, the Manny Marroquin tone shaper from Waves. Probably one of the only Waves plugins I still use, to be completely honest. It's kind of a little bit of a secret weapon. I really like this plugin, but a little bit of a parallel harmonic upper mid-range and top end processing. And then this guy, the Brit Channel, which is a console emulator that models a Neve console, and I put the channels all on every single aux master, and then on my master bus, I have the master, bus version that does all the summing and cross harmonic generating or whatever. So it's a subtle thing, but I feel like in the context of mixing, when you're hitting these different stages of distortion very subtly, it adds incrementally to your mix. It's a balancing act between making sure you're not losing too much transient information, because that's so important for a mix, but also still adding some vibe. After that, I go to my Ssl Buss Compressor by ADAM Audio, and I'm using the sidechain input with it. So I have a separate feed coming off my interfaces, line output, that goes to, that I use to EQ off the low end. I'm essentially using it as an EQ sidechain, a high pass filter sidechain input. So anything after 100 hertz doesn't affect the compressor. It's getting compressed by the snare drum, the guitars, the upper bits of the kick drum, but not by any type of sub information that could slow it down. So I'm hitting that, maybe like -2.
Not much like the tremors the next day.
And the nice thing about feeding a separate sidechain input into the compressor is that from my master auxes is that I get customization over what signals get fed and how much to the compressor. So for example, everything kind of gets fed equally out as they are arranged in the master section, except for the vocals. Since they tend to sit on top of everything, I often have the vocals, have the vocals kind of send at a lower volume to the compressor, so that if they're louder, if there's a section where the vocals are louder than everything else, the compressor doesn't hit hard and push down. They're not as affected. So that kind of really helps the compressor to be more efficient. It's just hitting on the kick and the snare, adding some punch, but not overall, drastically reducing your dynamic range. After that, I go to the STC8, which is a mastering style compressor. I barely hit this. I hit it at -1, -2. It's just tapping it, a little bit of the peak limiting. It's really just adding another stage of control without drastically reducing the dynamic range and the transients. Then after that, I go to a curve bender from UAD. Amazing EQ in real life, just as amazing in the plugin version. And as you can see, I'm just adding a little bit of top end, a little bit of mid-range, a little bit of low end. Very, very subtle, nothing over a dB on here. Normally, that's it. Usually, maybe I'll do a little bit of Ozone just to kind of send a reference, which I'm doing here. But in this case, I actually added one more stage of harmonic distortion just to kind of glue everything over. As you can see, I have it all the way down. It's not doing a ton.
Not much like the tremors the next day. It's on the radio. You dodge a bullet there. You turn another page, you tangle all loose ends tonight. Where you gonna run? Where you gonna...
Just a little bit of glue. And then Ozone, which is such an amazing plugin. I'm using a little bit of tape saturation, a little bit more EQ just to bring up the brightness, and then just a limiter to just kind of provide a little bit of limiting to bring it up in volume for the video. And for referencing, that's what I do for clients. I always provide clients my reference tracks with a limiter on, so they can hear what it'll sound like, relatively after it's mastered. That's the key. And I'm using two of the limiters to kind of make it a little bit easier. It's not one limiter working really, really hard. It's 2 limiters, splitting the difference in workload so that they're a bit more efficient. You get a little bit more transparency that way. So yeah, that's pretty much the mix. It's not rocket science. It's just a bunch of parts that you're kind of putting on together, making them fit, figuring out what works for this specific mix. Whatever I do on the next song will be different. So this is Aaron Bastinelli. Thanks so much for watching this video and listening to this song. This is the Narrowbacks on the radio. It was an absolute pleasure mixing on it, and I really hope that that you guys learned something new by watching.
Miracles can happen on these godforsaken streets. You wanna bury the